So today, everything you wanted to know about willow. And so I'm going to give you the story about willow. And I have to thank my colleagues from here and SUNY, ESF, and West Virginia University and Cornell, who've taken this ride with me over like almost the past decade. We've been thinking about willow as an energy crop mainly, but I call this biomass because I want you to be thinking about other uses of willow as well. And also, you know, you guys in the classroom, you know, interrupt me, and online, Dan, if you can monitor the Q&A or chat, I'm happy to get interrupted. Okay, so how did this story start? Well, prior to about 2012, like I said, a decade ago, we were working on, I'm a forester, forest economist. We were interested in woody bioenergy. So, you know, we were from our natural forest that you see in this region. And then along came a project that the USDA funded, which was a sort of a US effort called a coordinated agricultural projects to build up liquid energy fuels to replace gasoline. And this was around 2010, 11, 12, when gas prices were about $4 a gallon. So the movement was towards creating this bioeconomy. It focused on liquid fuels from biomass sources, in addition to forests. And so this is where we found out about work that had already been done at Cornell with Willowpedia. And they still have a great website. And then at SUNY ESF with their website. So there'd really been work on shrub willow in this region. And that culminated in our new bio project, which I'm sure you've heard of before. But between these three resources, everything you needed to know about willow is there. And then this is transitioned into mass bio. So we kind of continuing the story of looking at energy crops. Like I said, I'm going to focus on willow, but we also looked at switchgrass and miscanthus. All right, just to set the stage, you should all know about the types of feedstocks. I'm going to be focusing on the production side, the feedstock side. Later on in this course, you'll be seeing the processing. And energy crops fits in there with all these other kinds of biomass. And then we also need to think about the uses, right? So like I said, we've been focused on bioenergy, and there's three types. The liquid fuels was the focus of new bio and mass. Well, mass bio is broader than that. Solid biomass for heat or power, and then gaseous fuel, where it's converted into a gaseous form. And then mass bio has actually taken on these other uses, including biochar. So this is a nice diagram from Stephen Long, where he talks about the different types of feedstocks. And up here you have sort of the oils, soybeans, oil palm, jatropha. And here you have the sugars, and most of the bioenergy materials comes from maize, sugarcane, and soybean, for more on the oil side, the biodiesel. And those are what we call first generation fuels. And you can see transport fuels. But we're talking about this area here, and specifically willow falls under the short rotation coppice forest area. And you can see it has multiple uses, right? We can use it for heat, power, transport fuels. And you know, the technical costs could be low and high. Development time, and that's one of the biggest issues with this transition to using energy crops. And then from a sustainability, it's much higher than these first generations, which you should all know about because of the food versus fuel debate on these crops. Okay, well, in our region, you can look at this map, and we're very well endowed with forests, right? And there's been some studies to talk about the estimated biosupply. I'll talk a little bit about the billion-ton report, where this came from. But we're well suited to using bioenergy. This northeast area, mid-Atlantic, has 21% of the US population, but we only have a small amount of the land, as you can imagine. But we assume a lot of the petroleum supply. We're still heavily dependent on heating oil in the northeast. There is a big movement towards natural gas, which some people argue is a transition fuel. between, non-fossil fuels and renewable resources. But we're still heavily dependent on oil. So it's a perfect place to think about using, energy crops and forests for liquid fuels. The other thing with our forestry, which I don't really have time to get into, is many of them are not very well managed and have a lot of low use wood. What we mean is that most of the forests are harvested for the high value timber. And they don't really have a market for the low use wood. Like there is some pulp markets and there is some other kinds of chipping materials, and there are some small scale heat and uses of that for schools. But the problem is, there's not a big enough market for this. So it could create a market for it. Now, there are issues with using this because we've got such a big diversity of forests in our area, up to 50 species maybe on some plots of forest land. The ages, size, it's just not uniform. So that's where energy crops come in, because we can grow these material at a very even rate and know exactly what kind of volume we can get. So like I said, I'm focusing on the feedstock in this talk, which accounts to 50 to 70% of the delivered cost of the biomass to a refinery, depending on the distance and so on, and harvesting costs. So a colleague of mine about 15 years ago, Chuck Ray, put together this slide to show that Pennsylvania has a lot of forests, 16 million acres, and he estimated about 500 million tons of forest is underutilized. So if we think about that over an 80-year period, we're talking about 6 million dry tons per year that could be used in perpetuity if it was sustainably managed, and could be used to drive 45 electric plants with, millions of bags of wood pellets to heat homes, and ethanol plants, the liquid fuels that we're interested in. We could create 18 of those in the region. So the point is that there's a lot of wood. The issue is how to get it out at a reasonable price. And going a little bit further, you can, draw down, look at the green area, which is the forest area. And this map shows you the acreage by different plot sizes. So on the left, you can see forests of 15 acres or less. And then it gets less as you get to plot sizes of 150 acres or less, or more, I should say. And then on the right is 1,500 acres or more. And what you see, the point here is that most of this is in public lands. There's millions of private forest landowners who don't own a lot of acreage. And so if we were going to source this material from forests, we'd have to deal with these millions of people, because there's only a few people who own big chunks of our forest area. So there are constraints like that. And then there's also constraints about urbanization, development, people, landowners' willingness to provide forest material for energy biomass, just because of this human wildlife rural interface where people are living. Wildland urban interface. So just to finish off this idea of that, maybe it's more difficult just to rely on these forest low use wood resources, albeit there's a lot of them. I just want to show you the typical approach we use to harvest this stuff is, maybe it's a salvage cutting where we skid the trees to a landing. This is a debarker, which would remove the bark, and then it goes straight into a chipper and into the truck. So that's the typical forest harvesting for creating woody biomass. And before I get into the details of willow, I should mention another fast-growing species that could be used as a woody energy crop is hybrid poplar. And in fact, at our Rockview site, here you can see some willow trials, here you can see some poplar. We have tested poplar, but there is a problem with the canker septoria, which can kill it after its first cutting. So we haven't really exploited poplar. But here is a picture from the Midwest where it grows fantastically. Here it's more used, you could be used for lumber. Here's some early growing material in the Northwest where there's been a lot of work. In fact, one of our sister projects looked at poplar as liquid fuels and actually created some aviation fuels from poplar. It has a bit of a longer rotation than willow, 5 to 10 years. And it can also be used here in the Northwest with wastewater treatment, where they were spraying it. But it's also been used largely in plantations. Poplar is one of the most commonly planted hardwoods in the world. India, places like that, they use it a lot for many construction, timber, other uses. But here, this is a plantation along the Columbia River that was used by Greenwood Resources to grow poplar for energy crops. So it is an alternative, but not as conducive in our region because of the genetic issues with septoria. So shrub willow, let's talk about that. It's natural. It's found around here, mainly around streams and wet areas. It has a wide genetic base. Folks at Cornell have done a lot of work on this, which is a good thing. So you can breed for preferred traits like pest resistance or fast growing and so on. It is high yielding and fast growing. So here's some data from Tim Volk showing that it does have a wide range. I mean, on a per hectare basis, 1 to 3 megagrams, 3 tons per hectare is not a lot. And that's probably on poorer lands, but it can get up to this 9, 10 tons per hectare. I mean, per 10 to 15 on better quality lands. And one of the beauties with poplar is when you cut it, it resprouts. So you don't have to replant. And we estimate you can plant it, you can have these cycles of coppicing for 7 cycles before you have to replant. So lower management. And estimates, this was from the 2011 billion ton. There's enough to provide 1/3 of America's total energy crop production. This includes poplar at a $50 to $60 farm gate price. That's been updated a little bit, I'll show you. And shrub willow can be successfully grown on marginal lands. And that's the whole point of mass bio, is to focus more on marginal lands. And so these are the lands that might not be used as much for crops, right, for our food. This is the typical production cycle for willow. I'll get into a little more detail, but site preparation, it's almost like an agricultural crop. You want to eliminate as many of the weeds and get the land plowed. Then the planting, I'll talk a little bit about the methods for that. And then after the planting, the first year, usually what's done is the first year coppice in the first winter after planting. Usually plant in the spring. But it's a way to invigorate the roots, and you just brush hog it down. You don't get any, you don't harvest it for any material. You're just basically cutting it so you can get better growth the next years. And then it will regrow like this, and you got to be careful about the weeding. And then this could, after the first growing season, after the initial coppice, you can see this is what it could look like. And then you would grow it for 3 years, and then you would then you would harvest it after about 3 years, and then it would regrow back again, and then you would do 3 years again, up to about 20 years, so 7 cycles, and then you'd have to start the whole thing over again. And you might say, well, why can't we do it more? Well, you can, but the estimates are that the yields after a certain amount of time begin to become less. It has been shown after 2 or 3 coppices, yields actually go up. But the point is, after about 20 years, you're going to have better material, genetic material, faster growing material, higher yielding material. So you'll want to start the process over again anyway, presumably. Now, this is just some trials from our colleagues at Cornell, Larry Smart et al., Eric Fabio. And they just showed some trials that we have here at Rock Springs. We had a 24 species yield trial, and you can see the range of species in terms of the estimated biomass. And the purple ones, the Preble, Fabius, and this SX61 were ones that we have exploited and are using in some of our work right now. And this just shows you a shot of that yield trial, and I think it's evident. You can see these were about 24-foot square, and you can see here's just the edge where you can see 3 different varieties, very different growth habits and yields and so on. Some of these species, some of these cultivars came from Europe, didn't do as well here. Pests and diseases is a big issue. On the economics, you can think about a cash flow diagram, and SUNY ESF have what's called Eco Willow 2.0 area, which you can download and plug in your numbers. But basically, you've got all these upfront costs, and then you can start to get revenues every 3 years, and hopefully you can get a decent return after these upfront heavy investments. So we also created some extension materials during New Bio, and I'll just kind of go through sort of the elements of the production you need to think about. So down here is the types of expenses you would have and the amount you would have, prices, and then when they would occur, establishment year, first year after the first coppice, and then the first harvest, and then the following harvests. You can also look at the discounting present value of these cash flows. So for example, we plant about 6,000 seedlings, or cuttings, I should say, per acre. You can look at the estimated costs. This is where we have a spreadsheet where you can put in your own numbers. Then you have to deal with soil fertility. Now, usually nitrogen is something that's added, but it depends on the site as to the needs for these other uses. We did add some lime. We didn't add any lime. We did add some. We also talk about the costs of the fertilizer application. But these are all things you might need to add to your site. Lime would be very important, especially if it's a old mining site. Weed control, very important for both to get the site ready, the burn down, then the pre-emergence right after you've planted, and then after they start to sprout leaves and post budding, you might need to add some post emergence, which can be quite costly, and then the spraying costs as well. So that's part of the expenses. And then once it's established, or to establish it and maintain it, you obviously need some plowing, disking, planting, which is a big cost, and then the mowing of the first year coppice. So these are all kinds of expenses you might have, and you can look at the spreadsheet if you want to play with it. And then when it comes to harvesting, you've got to have the machinery to harvest it. And then you can look at the revenue side of the equation. And in this scenario, we just estimated 4 dry tons per acre per year, about 8 to 10 tons per hectare. And we estimated about $45 per ton. And so you can see, and you can obviously change these variables. You can see the returns, and you can subtract it from the expenses. And you can see in our case, it came out a little bit negative. But you can obviously change this value. And you can also look at payback period and assumptions about your interest rate. So the point is just to show you this cash flow. And I also just wanted to show you the expenses that go into this. So it's not a cheap production system, but it could have big payoffs. And it all comes down to this price, this farm gate price. That's the tipping point between using energy crops versus forest material versus oil and gas. So this is the updated billion-ton report by my colleague Matt Langholtz, is also on our project again, and they're going to be updating this billion-ton report. but they did make, I pulled out matrices for 2018, and then they project future prices and combinations of those prices at $30, $50, and $100. So in those future scenarios, how much material can you get for $30, $50, and $100? So if you look at the bottom first, you can see 2018, which is sort of now, they're projecting most of the material still going to be at the $30, $50, $100 going to come from corn stove and hay. And that's where most of the ethanol fuels and so on and material comes from still. The price points just haven't reached our energy crop interests. And so in 2030, yeah.
So related to this slide, we have a question from Sal Grover.
Yeah.
About, where do these prices come from? What influences what the price is, or are these all just hypothetical numbers at this point?
The prices for the billion-ton report, yeah. So we in our spreadsheet we put $45 a ton because that's about the going price for a ton of chips in Pennsylvania delivered. So we use that as a proxy. To really be profitable for willow, as in our scenarios, we were looking at $60 to $70 a ton. All right. And in this billion-ton report, you can see they had a range from $30 to $100. So you can play with this, and I just looked at these three prices just to see at their given modeling how much would be available of different types of feedstocks. And you can see, but as the market grows and there's more interest, they project in 2030, we can even, if the prices are $30 a ton, we're not going to get much energy crops at all. But at $50 a ton, we'll start to see some switchgrass and some willow production, the red. But then if we can get to the $100 per farm gate per ton for farm gate prices, we'll see more willow production in terms of providing feedstocks for this bioeconomy. So price points are really important in growing this industry. Just a few photos of the planting. So basically the way it's planted is from a cutting like this. If you were just going to put it in the ground, as we have done for some of our trials, you would just take a cutting from what we call these willow whips, about 8 inches, and just hammer it into the ground, about 4 inches deep. And in the spring it'll sprout, as long as the buds are upright. And then, but if you're commercially doing it, you need this kind of machinery at a large scale. And so the Europeans have actually, when we got into this in the 2012, 2014 period, there was already about 10,000 hectares of this in Sweden, Eastern Europe. So the Scandinavians and Eastern Europe, so they already planted quite a bit of willow, and Ireland as well. But you can see this planter, they're standing, and this is double row planting, right? And so you'll see one of the methods we use is planting double rows, because that's more conducive to the type of planting and harvesting versus single row. But there's many ways you can design your willow production. This picture just shows you the importance of weeding. If it's not clear, you can see on the left they did weeding, on the right they didn't. And it just would overgrow the willow itself. So weeding is a critical component. Now this is the harvester. So this is a 2-row harvester. New Holland designed it. It's basically a forage harvester that's used for wheat and other crops like that, hay. And here you can see that they've created this coppice header, which I'll show you a better picture in a minute. But it goes down, yeah, you can see it's a double row. This catcher is catching the material, and then it's sucked into these coppice header saws, which then get funneled back through this into the truck. Chucked, into the truck. So this is a unique header designed for willow. There's also one for poplar. The big issue is the size of the material. You know, that's why 3 years is kind of like an optimal time to harvest, because if you let it grow much longer than that, the stems might be too high in diameter for this coppice header to work well. This is a close-up of the header. This is just this is one that SUNY owns, and this is another one that we had on display at Ag Progress Days, and you can see the cutting head. This is a single row harvester. Some colleagues up at AA Willow used one of these, and you can see how it funnels into, these are single rows of the material. And there's just, you can see the cutting head. That equipment all came from Europe. Well, that came from Europe, as did this innovative attempt at biobaling. So where they cut it and they bale it at the same time. This is also from Europe, and I haven't seen much success, or because it's hard to you have problems with stoppages because of stuff getting stuck. Now, this is our attempt at Rock Springs. To bring down the equipment, those cutting headers and the harvester are in New York, right? So we want to kind of save on transportation costs, especially if we only have a couple of acres. We do have 30 acres that we need to cut where we'll have to bring down the equipment, but this was just a small job. So we tried to do it on our own with a chainsaw. It didn't work too well. Then we ended up just using it by hand. And here you can see our homemade, piling it up and shipping it. You know, not the greatest, but that is a big issue, the equipment costs. This is actually in Poland, where we saw these guys, they had created their own little harvesting machine. Now, the big issue is, I'm sure you've all seen what a clean chip looks like. It's nice and fresh, debarked. I showed you that forestry operation. This is typically what wood chips from willow look like. It is problematic in the sense of it's not as uniform as clean chips are straight out of a forest operation. You see some of them look like bullet size, and then there's little chips. And so this is one of the constraints. You know, we tried to market this to Fuel for Schools and other places, and they were wary about the inconsistency. But for liquid fuels and those kind of things, you know, it's biomass. And so depending on the use, you know, this can work well. All right, so we talked about, you know, one of the big markets we have is obviously liquid fuels. I mean, there's, you know, solar and wind don't replace liquid fuels. You know, so we have to, biomass can, you know, the carbon neutral issue. But, you know, we saw in Pennsylvania while we're doing this project, there was a corn ethanol plant that was for sale because of just low productivity, low demand for ethanol at that time. Heat and power is another big source, and this is also where the fuel is agnostic. It doesn't matter. Obviously, you can make pellets out of this, and I know Dan Chokas has tried to work on this, but you know, that's one use, pellet production, even household pellet production. And then in northern New York, where the majority of the willow is planted, and I'll show you that in a little bit, but here you can see the willow production areas. And they were actually feeding these refineries who were buying the willow from these sites for biopower. And they still are doing it. There's about 10,000 acres, I believe, still in production that's feeding one of these re-energy as bio. So they're making electricity from willow. When we found out that the schools wouldn't take our willow and other places, we actually sold it to an environmental company that was making these silt socks for preventing runoff from their construction sites. So that was a sort of an emergency use, but also a lot of these silt socks are made from woody biomass. Another potential market is bedding we explored. You know, the issues with some of the bedding material, especially for poultry, because it can affect, create diseases like in the foot here. And we did find some success with willow chips in poultry bedding. Now, will you fetch a marketable price compared to the $40, $50, $60 a ton I was talking about for energy? That's obviously a question. All right, are we seeing any other questions coming through?
I have a question about bedding for horses. So you had a picture of horses up there. Have they done any research to see that if a horse were to eat the willow, if it would be like poisonous to them or like it would be safe? Because I know like you have to be careful about like what sawdust you put in the stall.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. No, that's a great question. So obviously, you have to be very careful with wood in horses because of the juglans, the walnut species. It's actually, I don't know, Dan knows more about it, but willow, apparently, if it's straight willow, it's okay. Now, willow does have salicylin, which is in the bark. It's a compound that actually they used to be made, aspirin was made from salicylin, and they've obviously synthesized it now, but I don't think that negatively affects horses, right? I don't think they'd really chew on the bark anyway, or would they?
Depends on the horse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Horse.
Okay, and I hope you guys can hear the questions. I should have repeated it, but it was about horses and willow. All right, what time does the class end? 10 or 12:10? Or?
Yeah, 1:05.
Oh, 10 minutes. Yeah, okay. Let me move along. So I just want to bring in the marginal lands question because that's the focus of Mass Bio. So here's a reclaimed mine, and where they've dumped material, and you can see stuff growing. It looks like a mess, but it's low compaction, which is good. And then you can look at a reclaimed mine site that we applied biosolids, and this is actually what this site looks like after the growing season. So here we had to come in and plow, because it was an old abandoned mine site. This is a fresh site, so we're able to loosely compact to get growth. So the question is marginal lands. And why marginal lands? Because they probably don't have, you can't grow a lot of corn on these lands, right? It might be rocky, it just might not get enough yield. And generally we argue that willow, switchgrass, others require less fertile soils. But the question is, most people think of marginal in terms of biophysical, just the soils are poor or something. But we've shown in our studies that economic and social marginality is as important, if not more important. So biophysical, you should all know what the issues are with those: steep slopes, climate, etc., soil fertility, drainage. But economic marginally basically relates to profit. So basically what we're interested in is, can we, on these marginal lands, can willow be more profitable than food crops? And so we did some studies up in our region during New Bio, and we had some funding from the Biomass Crop Assistance Program, which is an incentive program, which is really important to get these new technologies off the ground. But we looked at actually miscanthus in this area because there was interest there, switchgrass in this area, and then I mentioned the willow production up in northern New York. From our study, what we really found was farmers were willing, and landowners, but they preferred switchgrass mainly because they'd heard of it. They hadn't, what's miscanthus? What is this willow stuff? So education is really important. All right. And then as to this marginality question, we asked them, what would be your concern with growing the crops? And basically you can see that only the main biophysical issue was about a third of them saying they had poor soils. The main issue was these economic issues like low economic return, access, production, lack of time. So economic factors are the main constraints we have to get over, and you can't just use biophysical factors to explain marginality. So within this study, we asked farmers what they're willing to accept to grow these crops. And sorry. And so their mean was about 100, they wanted to get $140 a ton. Remember I talked about $40 for forest material, $70 kind of break even for the willow in our scenarios. We've done these break-even scenarios, you know, they can range from 40 to 60, and depending on the material. And then you ask the industry, the ones who are going to buy this feedstock for their biorefineries, they want $50 on average. You know, they want less than that because they've got their price points too. It's basically the sugar they want, right? And so we got 140 from the willingness to accept by the growers. There's a big gap. And that's something we need to really think about. All right, let me just end off with a few other uses. You know, riparian buffers has been talked about. Forested buffers are great for reducing nitrogen and nutrient runoff and sediment runoff. Can we grow willow in these buffers and have a market for them? I mean, the roots are really strong and can deal with these sediments. Colleagues at New York have looked at snow fences. This is actually one of, I think, I-87 in New York, where you can see it actually has reduced. They've shown that it does, with the prevailing winds, create less need for plowing in those areas that have the willow snow fence. They've also done some work at ESF on biodiversity, pollination. So willow can provide multiple uses and these non-market values as well. And then wastewater treatment plants. In Sweden, they've tried it. In New York, on some old industrial mine sites, they've planted willow, and they use it for bioremediation to take out some of the hazardous material from the soil. And then finally, we try to do it ourselves here in Pennsylvania at our living filter. This is some willow we planted, and we're spraying wastewater irrigation from our very own Penn State area into these. And you can see it looks a bit crazy here. It looks like a big shrub, but it's actually because of you know, the weight of the water. But we've realized that it's very plastic and it bounces back well. Be interesting to see what it looks like today with the ice we've been having. But so far, and this is the third year, we're going to be harvesting actually in the next week or two. And so one of we expect much higher yields than at our other sites, mainly because of the water irrigation. It likes water. And then that might be a sign that we should look for places that are waterlogged that could use this wastewater to produce the biomass, because it's much more higher yielding than other places. So multiple uses for willow other than energy as well. All right, finally, the markets, you know, the risk premium and uncertainty, the competition, but it does diversify farm income if farmers plant multiple crops. I mentioned, you know, the feedstock, you know, if we can cut costs with that, is the establishment and the harvesting costs. You saw the machinery. And, you know, it just adds to the diversity and good for the environment, as I showed you some of the other market values. Now, my last slide is about, you know, which crops should we use? You know, in Mass Bio, we've got switchgrass as well, right? So I just wanted to give you some pluses and minuses. The willow, we only harvest every 3 years. Switchgrass is every year, right? Both of them don't have any issues with liquid fuels. But if we're going to use it for heat and power, the willow has lower ash content, lower chloride content, and is generally higher per PTU per pound than the grasses. And also, when you're using grasses in stoves, it's been shown to create these clinkers that don't occur as much with willow. And then finally, our good colleague Azad, who did his PhD with Daniel Chokas, looked at debarking, right? I mean, the psilocybin is the bark. So if we can extract the bark, we can use it for some of those medicinal purposes. And then get the clean wood. Like, remember I showed you that bark chip quality? If we can get the clean stems that look like this, with the economical debarking system, we can maybe find a better market for it at a higher price. Obviously, the trade-off is the cost of the debarking system versus the benefit of debarking it. And the issues of growing, when you grow it, obviously, it's actually easier to debark during the growing season when it's fresh, but we want to harvest the biomass in the dormant season, because maybe didn't mention this, but you want to harvest in the winter when the leaves are down, because all those nutrients in the leaves will go back into the soil, and we don't have all that leafy material when we're harvesting it. There's a bit of a trade-off here of that system. And that's all I have.